Good afternoon, and welcome to the Atlantic Council's virtual convening series, Election 2020, America's Role in the World. I am Colleen Bell, the Executive Director of the California Film Commissioner, and also former U.S. Ambassador to Hungary. I am also the co-chair of Elections 2020, the Atlantic Council's virtual platform for bipartisan, informative conversations on the matters concerning America's role in the world. Over the past 2 weeks, we have had the pleasure to host leading voices from the foreign policy and national security community for insightful discussions on the main challenges and opportunities that will appear on the international stage in the next 4 years. We had the pleasure to engage experts on a broad range of issues, ranging from cybersecurity to environmental policy, from military and defense strategy to the rise of authoritarianism around the world. We will be back on Monday, August 31st, for a special discussion with me and Ambassador Paula Dobriansky to discuss the Democratic and Republican conventions and unpack the main foreign policy themes that have emerged from these conventions. As always, you can sign up and rewatch our past sessions on the Atlantic Council's website, atlanticcouncil.org/elections2020. You can follow us on Twitter at Atlantic Council and use the hashtag ACElections2020 to send questions and engage in the conversation. Now, I am pleased to introduce today's session, which will look at the role and influence of foreign policy in the 2020 elections. We all know that presidential campaigns and nominating conventions tend to be dominated by domestic themes. The candidates' foreign policy views are only occasionally highlighted on the campaign trail and during debates, and these issues tend to be of secondary importance to voters. Now 2020 has been anything but conventional, and the coronavirus pandemic has brought to the fore the close relationship between domestic and international affairs. Should we expect foreign policy to swing voters in November? Or is this still a non-issue for most Americans? At the same time, where is public opinion on foreign policy issues? The series has discussed the main challenges that the United States will face in the next decade. How are those same challenges perceived by voters? Over the last 2 weeks, our guests have given us their perspective on America's role in the world. But what do Americans think this role should be? To guide our conversation on foreign policy's role in the elections and public attitudes toward global threats and U.S. leadership, we have an extraordinary group of analysts who have joined us here today. To guide the discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, NBC News correspondent, Ms. Carol Lee. Carol Lee is a leading reporter for NBC on North Korea, the Middle East, the Russia probe, and the Trump administration. Carol has also covered the White House for the Wall Street Journal and Politico. Her deep expertise reporting on politics, foreign affairs, and domestic policy issues makes her the perfect person to moderate today's conversation. Carol, thank you very much for joining us for this important discussion. I would also like to thank our viewers for joining us today and for Samsung for powering this series. Carol, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bell, and thank you to everyone who's joining for this discussion. This is a fantastic panel that brings such a depth of expertise to these topics. I'd like to introduce them. We have Charlie Cook, who's editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report, Celinda Lake, president of Lake Research Partners, Dr. Norman Ornstein, who's a resident scholar, senior scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and Christine Soltis Anderson, who is partner and co-founder of Echelon Insights. Thank you all. We're really lucky to have you for this discussion. And I want to dive right in. I'm really excited to talk to you all about this. It's something I'm very interested in. And I'd like to start with a question really for each of you that just generally gets at the role of foreign policy in the 2020 elections. How much do Americans care about foreign policy and national security issues this election cycle? And how is that different from, say, past elections that we've had recently? And let's just, if we go in alphabetical order, we can go start with Celinda, Charlie, Kristen, and then Norm, if that works for you.
Great, thank you. So I think that how much Americans care about foreign policy is one way to look at it, and it's about the sixth ranked issue. But I think in this election, foreign policy is actually standing out as a surrogate for leadership style. And I think in the end, leadership and character will make a big difference in this election. And foreign policy will play a much more distinctive role, particularly as the contrast is drawn about what kind of leader do you want. This is particularly true, important to women voters and to suburban voters, college educated voters. And I think there's a very, very stark contrast here. You have someone who is egotistical, erratic, tweets. You had at one point half of swing voters who thought that Donald Trump could tweet us into a war, mainly driven by women, versus someone who is experienced, steady, strong, knows how to keep our allies, knows how to deal with our enemies. So I think this is a very strong character contrast. And I think that's the way you'll see it play out in the fall.
That's great. Kristen?
Sure. So I think that foreign policy, as discussed, is not a top tier issue, but is woven in very closely with what has emerged as the top tier issue, and that is COVID-19. The issue of China has been one that for many elections was not really on many voters' radar. Donald Trump had been talking about it for a long time, and I think it's likely that that was a piece of why he was able to stand out in that Republican primary 4 years ago. But you've seen over the last couple of years the unfavorable ratings for China go from, it was about even, according to Pew Research Center data at the start of Trump's presidency, to now you have 66% of Americans say they feel unfavorably toward China. And those are numbers, again, that had been trending negative well before COVID-19. And it's also not just exclusively about Republicans. 62% of Democrats, as well as 72% of Republicans, say they feel unfavorably toward China. So while I wouldn't say China itself is the top issue or a top tier issue in this election, I think it is woven in very deeply to economic anxieties. And then with COVID-19, China has become a healthcare issue in addition to being an economic and security issue. So I think in that way, foreign policy has had a significant footprint. Additionally, the question of how do we deal with other nations in combating and controlling this virus has led to having foreign relations become a little bit more critical. This is not just a US domestic problem, this is a global problem, and watching how America has or hasn't succeeded in containing the virus in contrast to other countries or in cooperation with other countries, I think is on many voters' minds.
And Charlie, I'm sorry, I skipped over you on accident. Go ahead.
That's okay. I feel a little self-conscious. I mean, here I am on a panel talking about dynamics like this with Norm Ornstein, who is just one of the greatest political scientists of all time, and two fabulous pollsters, and Carol Lee, one of the best political reporters out there. So I'm feeling a little self-conscious here. But somebody has to play the role of the skunk at the picnic. And I don't think that foreign policy issues directly or indirectly, sadly, I don't think they're going to be very important. B, I don't think issues are very important. C, I'm not sure Joe Biden is, I mean, I think this is a referendum up or down on President Trump, and so many things are baked into that cake about President Trump. And sadly, America's role in the world, our relationships, leadership for 75 years, all this are things that ought to be really, really important. And I wish were topics in this debate, in this campaign, but really aren't. I mean, it's just going to be about Donald Trump, just as the midterm elections. They were only about Donald Trump. And so I don't, I think I think foreign policy issues are incredibly important, but I just don't think anything can eclipse whether you like Donald Trump or whether you love him or whether you loathe him. I don't think any issues really penetrate there, other than perhaps handling or mishandling the coronavirus. But so anyway, somebody had to red team this proposition.
We appreciate that. Norm, do you want to weigh in what you think? Did we lose him?
First, thanks, Charlie, for the nice words, which I would say your modesty should not be there. You're the best of the best. Having said that, let me parse out a little bit more. I think on a larger scale, Charlie is right. This is a referendum on the president, but I also think that we're going to have a little bit of a choice here, that it is going to be issues of leadership, maturity, of empathy. That will play out and it'll have an impact perhaps on foreign policy, but more of an indirect one. But I think we can also look at some other things. Kristen started by talking about China. You could see from the Republican convention and from the other things that Donald Trump has said in the past that, in fact, he's trying to skirt around the coronavirus issue, the COVID issue, by saying, I had nothing to do with it. I'd made America great again. We had the best economy in the history of the world. And then China undermined us. And we're going to see a push and a focus there to try and go after China that could have reverberations in other ways, including in some issues of foreign policy, like trade, which I think could make a real difference. Charlie's right that our electorate tends to divide very much on whether you like Trump or don't like Trump. But what we could also see, in fact, from both conventions was some farmers saying, these tariffs, the way they've handled the trade issue have been devastating to me. And then, of course, a few on the Republican convention saying, thank God, now we've really got ourselves in order here and our orders are up and things are going well. How much those economic issues, which are very much related to foreign policy, will matter is going to be an interesting phenomenon. We also may have Russia factor in as an issue, not just because of what we saw, especially with the Republican convention, the disdain for the Russian probe and its implications, which came up again and again and again, but also, of course, with the Senate Intelligence Committee report, which is a pretty devastating takedown of what Russia did in 2016 and again in 2020. And if we think about Russian interference in the election, that sure seems to me to be a foreign policy issue. And finally, let me say it often becomes an issue when it comes to specific constituencies. So I don't think it's a coincidence that we have a deal just reached with the United Arab Emirates and Israel. It's very much the timing of it tied to an attempt to try and sway votes. And we may see other actions here that will also impinge on our ability to deal with actors abroad, adversaries and others that are tied to an attempt to sway voters one way or the other. In the largest sense, we know that foreign policy is not the top tier thing that matters unless we're in the middle of a war. Of course, we could talk about Afghanistan and both parties struggling over how many troops we keep in the Middle East and what we do there. It can be driven by events. It's not going to be the most significant factor, but I think in many specific ways it could weigh in with marginal voters.
So Linda, I wanted to pick up on something that you were mentioning about how it's more about the way that the character issue or the leadership issue rather than the specific policy issues. What is the mood of voters? Do they prefer Trump's sort of unpredictable or unconventional style on the world stage? Do they want to lean toward a Biden who's status quo likely and something very familiar that people have seen before on the world stage? And do these books and stories like the one John Bolton wrote about the president, are they having any impact on voters whatsoever?
So a really interesting question and a kind of an unprecedented time to ask that question. First of all, I would say it depends on which voters, right? There is a Trump base. It is distinct, and Kristen's more of an expert on this than I am, but it is distinct from the Republican base. But there is a Trump base that likes his style. People in general tend to think of him as pretty patriotic, and you see that being reinforced in the Republican convention, that this is a guy who loves his country. Women, much more troubled by his style than men. And this has been true for at least 2 years. And what's really interesting to me is I think COVID was a bit of a shifting point, because what we saw with COVID was that what was kind of an idiosyncratic personal style, well, he's not a politician. We knew what we were getting. We saw him on The Apprentice. now became a governing style, and a visible governing style on your TV to your family every day. And that profoundly influenced women. Women also tend to see the world as a lot more dangerous. And it's an interesting issue, right? Because now we have the Republicans trying to elevate the security threat of quote unquote protests and violence and that kind of thing, and the Democrats elevating the security threat of having such an erratic leader in the world, and that we need our allies. We need to work together. So I think it depends on who you're talking to, but for the vast majority of women and for non-Republican or non-Trump voters, it definitely matters to them, and it's a style that they don't like.
I want to ask Norm, because you talked a little bit about this, but has the coronavirus, has the pandemic, how has that shifted the way that public opinion on America's role in the world, and specifically just changes in terms of the view of multilateralism versus unilateralism and those sorts of things? What's your take on that?
Sure. So, remember that this first came up with the discussion of the Wuhan virus and the China virus, but then it spilled over to the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the role internationally of trying to combat this. It's played out, I think, in another way as well, which is the contrast between how the United States has handled the coronavirus and how other countries, including especially our allies, like Australia, for example, have handled it, and European countries. The president has harshly criticized the European countries for what they've done, but we know that where countries have moved very quickly to shut things down and to use masks and testing and contact tracing, it's had a different implication. This is going to come up, I think, in another way. One of the areas where we're seeing contention in Congress, and it hasn't yet played out because we haven't had this new recovery bill, we'll get it coming back to the fore in September, is the issue of whether we are going to provide some relief for especially the poorer countries around the world. If and as we move towards a vaccine or a set of vaccines, we know that some of those vaccines are going to be expensive enough that they'll only be useful for richer countries. Are we going to subsidize other countries, do what we traditionally have done to deal with some of these issues and problems around the world? And I think in all of those respects, including our withdrawal from the WHO and the ways in which we have separated ourselves out from other countries, this will play into the election. It's not going to affect, I think, large numbers of votes. What will affect the votes more is going to be whether we see another resurgence in the virus as we head into flu season, right at the time of the campaign's hot moments and the election itself, what that will do to turnout, whether people will turn more against Trump. And I will say one thing we know is that in terms of handling COVID, and our public opinion experts can say more about this, the public as a whole is not real happy with Donald Trump on this. It's not clear to me, however, that it's shaken many of his voters, those who, as Charlie said, like him and are with him, even if they don't think he's done a particularly good job with this.
So on that point, Charlie and Kristen, you can also weigh in. How has it changed, and particularly in the battleground states? Is there any movement over this issue?
Well, I think we've seen a dramatically different situation than what we were looking at for the first, say, 4 months of the year. About a month in, starting about April or May, really, you started seeing the president's numbers kind of flutter with doubts about his handling of the coronavirus. Started his numbers downstream a little, down a little bit, and then we saw the ballot test numbers starting to move in June. But I started to say that, okay, foreign policy is not important. It's just up or down about President Trump, but it's also about culture and identity politics. And my wife and I are sequestered on the mid-coast of Maine right now. And I'm looking over at a dock in an empty fish house where Chuck, our neighborhood lobsterman, held court until he went out of business this winter because of tariffs against China. But the thing about it is, and I'll disagree a little bit with Norm, I think it's hard to find a farmer, it's hard to find a lobsterman, people that have been adversely impacted policy-wise and foreign policy. But I was talking to a beef cattleman, or this is early in the administration, and I asked him, "Are you worried about tariffs?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm really worried about tariffs." But the next thing out of his mouth was, "But I think everything the president's doing is what he believes is in the national interest, and I support him 100%." And I'm going, it's like I can't believe this. But his base, anybody that stayed with him, that 40% that is his base, they're not leaving no matter what. Anybody with the capacity for outrage has already been outraged. And that number is not going to go down below where it is now. But the other 60% of the electorate, they're either on the negative side or their doubts about him are getting higher and higher. But roll the world, all these things are kind of baked in the cake, but they're not individual discrete issues.
Charlie, let me ask you a question related to all of that. Do you think that will have the same impact down ballot? Do you think, for example, that the farmers in Iowa who've been hurt might take it out on Joni Ernst, even though they stick with Donald Trump because of that tribal identity?
Well, if you were asking me, I think Joni Ernst is in deep trouble. I'm not sure it's the farmers. I'm not sure it's rural so much. To me, it's independence, the erosion, and I defer to the two pollsters, but we saw an enormous erosion among independents as the coronavirus, all of this started rising. And I think it's there, but among, it's small town, rural folks like that. This is about identity. This is about, he speaks for me. He speaks, and so, but having said that, I think Republicans are going to have a horrible night in the Senate, but I think it's more going to be in independents just breaking overwhelmingly against not just the president, but against Republicans down ballot. His base, I'm never going to leave him. And small town rural whites are definitely white farmers, definitely in that base.
The other group that I think is important here, Carol, is seniors. When you take a look at the crosstabs of groups that Trump had done reasonably well with in 2016, but where those numbers have really fallen off since the start of COVID, senior citizens that's it. I have studied millennial politics for a decade now. I have been preaching to Republicans for a decade that they have got to get with the program or they're going to lose young voters. And now those millennials are almost 40 years old and they still break for Democrats by huge margins. But if you look at many polls these days, senior citizens are voting like millennials. It's wild. And I think it would be hard to suggest that isn't at least in some way due to COVID-19, which is disproportionately having massive negative health effects on senior citizens.
Elena, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to comment a little bit on the whole China phenomenon because I think it is, and Kristen raised it first, I think it is an identity issue. I think it is a foreign policy issue. It is an economic issue. The president is seen as much stronger in standing up to China. And that has a lot of derivative positives for him. It emphasizes strength, and they're certainly trying to drive that strength for this weakness piece. It emphasizes put America first, which is testing quite strongly. And you notice both candidates talking about putting America first. You have Joe Biden having released the Buy America plan, and let's make sure that the PPE is produced in the United States and we don't have to rely on China in another crisis. So I think that, and then you see it playing out in local races, like you see McSally desperately trying to pull out her race with attacking Kelly on China and his investments in China with China. So I think that this China thread, which isn't really a foreign policy issue, it's more, as others have said here, identity, economic strength. That thread is pulling strong. The other thread that's interesting is Russia, where Joe Biden has the strength. And you see Vote Vets, for example, an organization launching an ad today where they're hitting again on when the Russians put bounties on our troops. Donald Trump did nothing and made friends with Putin, and you saw Susan Rice making the same attacks. So there's some interesting threads here where individual countries are playing a role, and it's playing a role about whose side are you on, and what is your tribe, as Norm was saying.
Carol, if I can just jump in on China, what's interesting to me is China, we hear so much about it, and this is not to disagree at all with what Celinda said. We hear so much about China, but it's not about what should our policy be towards China. What you've got is President Trump and Joe Biden are each sort of using China, more Trump than Biden, as a cudgel to beat the hell out of the other one. And it's so that it's not a substantive issue. It's a tool. They're trying, it's a weapon. But what should our policy be towards China? And I think Joe Biden has a lot of interesting things to say, but nobody's listening for that. So, he doesn't even bother. But it's really using it as a weapon, not really as a substantive issue, which obviously it is a legitimate issue, but that's not what we're hearing.
I suspect that China is going to be a massive issue in the Republican primary of 2024. I think there's a reason why you see folks like Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, everyone in Congress who maybe even thinks they might possibly maybe run for president in 2024 wants to be a part of what the China task force is doing. This is something that perhaps your median voter may think of occasionally in terms of an issue like trade, or perhaps more acutely nowadays in terms of COVID-19. But I do believe this is something that for the Republican base is going to be a much more long-term animating issue.
It's so interesting that how things have flipped in some ways on China. For a long time, Democrats were tougher on China than Republicans were. It was about human rights and it was about trade at a time when Democrats were more protectionist and Republicans were more for free trade. And now you don't have anybody basically saying good things about China, but it's pretty clear that Republicans have seized on this issue more and made it more of a force and factor for themselves. And it's also interesting, especially with 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, with one of the worst human rights abuses that we have seen in decades, that the Republicans were able to bring a human rights hero from China who was able to escape and achieve asylum here. They're talking at the convention last night, trying to, at least in some ways, neutralize the human rights element, although it's not at all clear how many votes go on that basis anyhow.
Kristen, you mentioned some of the lawmakers who may run in 2024. I wanted to ask you about just Congress generally. We've seen in foreign policy that without the bipartisan backing of foreign policy initiatives, and really the backing of Congress, that it can all be very fleeting. I mean, President Trump's basically undone everything what President Obama tried to do or did do in his second term, from the Iran deal, the Paris Climate Accord, obviously TPP stalled, but the Cuba reopening. And so 2 questions. One is bipartisanship on foreign policy just dead? And 2, when you look at the congressional map, how consequential are some of the House and Senate races in terms of shaping foreign policy over the next 4 years?
Well, I think it comes down to where foreign policy gets made. And the executive is always going to have the biggest role in that front. The House has a much smaller role than the Senate, to be sure, but foreign policy is traditionally something that the president drives. So there, I actually believe, is a reasonable amount of bipartisanship on foreign policy. The area where you see Republicans the most apt to criticize President Trump is on foreign policy issues. When it came to withdrawing troops from Syria, for instance, that was something where you had a number of folks who are pretty big fans of President Trump on most issues in Congress, nonetheless come out and say, whoa, why are we abandoning our Kurdish allies? So there are, I think, a handful of foreign policy issues where, because Donald Trump so completely obliterated the McCain-Romney era consensus, frankly, Bush-McCain-Romney era consensus around foreign policy in the party, those fractures still exist and frankly give Republicans more room to agree with Democrats on some issues, creating those strange fault lines. So I think that the fact that we're seeing these big swings in foreign policy has everything to do with Trump being a very unconventional president rather than necessarily a particular breakdown of bipartisanship around foreign policy. If anything, I would suggest there may be more bipartisanship there on some things than on a whole host of domestic issues.
The other thing I would add is that the public really wants bipartisanship. And particularly those senior voters. And Kristen, you're totally right on the importance of senior voters. And we're doing better with senior voters than we've done since 2000, before 2008. But they really want Democrats and Republicans to work on, and people do not expect any kind of bipartisanship from Donald Trump. Even his best friends don't think that's possible. So that's a very, very important point that you're raising.
You know, it's so interesting to see the contrast that we have now. This is in some ways a populist takeover of the Republican Party, and it's a reflection of the fact that it is far more a Trump party than anything else. The criticism has been not just of the Obama foreign policy, and even more than of the Clinton foreign policy, it's of the Reagan, first Bush, second Bush foreign policy just as much. Remember, Ronald Reagan wanted to promote America's interests around the world. He helped to create the U.S. Institute of Peace, the National Democratic Institute, and the National Republican Institute, and a whole lot of other entities. And all of that now is sort of put into a bucket of criticism by the administration. But we also have most of the Republicans in Congress, even when they criticize some elements of the policy, as Kristen said, do it pretty quietly and don't follow up in any way. It's not like the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held blistering hearings criticizing any of this. In fact, they haven't held any oversight hearings on any elements of it. And the interesting question is going to be when Trump leaves. Certainly, I think the people who are going to be fighting to be his heirs will be led by those who want to continue those policies. It's the Tom Cottons and the Josh Hawleys who are going to be out there in a very visible way. But we're going to see others, including those who basically before Trump went along with the more conventional foreign policy that really was the Bushes and Reagans and otherwise, maybe step up and be a little bit more supportive of the NATO alliance, more critical of Russia, and maybe move in a different direction. How much remains to be seen. But right now, what we've seen is really a takeover of the party from unconventional sources. It didn't start, I would say, with Trump either. You could go back to Pat Buchanan with many of his approaches to foreign policy, which was a kind of right-wing populism as well.
Let me put my skunk cap back on. I would argue, I mean, I agree that foreign policy issues is the one area that Republican members have been willing to substantively step out away from the president a little bit. But I would argue that that's the only ones that they can do that because the Trump base really doesn't care much about foreign policy. So that's the only area where they can kind of get away with creating some distance with the president and showing they're not just with him 100%, where they feel like that's kind of a free, they get a pass as long as they don't get too critical of the president. But what was that vote? It was like 90, it was the Russia sanctioning the Russia for on the interfering in the election. What was that? Like a 95-5 vote or 98-2 vote. I mean, the president had practically no support at all, but they thought they could get away with it, and they did get away. And you know, it's like no harm, no foul.
I wanted to talk specifically about one policy. There's foreign policy, and then there's deploying troops overseas in war. And I think Norm mentioned Afghanistan. Obviously, President Trump promised that he would end this war. President Obama promised also to bring troops home. Everyone has struggled with this. It's been going on for decades now, as we all know. Where is the voter sentiment on this right now in terms of bringing troops home, ending the war in Afghanistan? And has that changed? And have the changes in demographics changed this?
We don't have any recent data on that, Kristen. I don't know if you do, or Norm or Charlie, if you have seen that. We have explored more expanded engagement and people are definitely anti-expanded engagement. And I would think that would be even more so now, where people think we're out of money, we're the ones hurting, we got to take care of ourselves. And Norm, I had never even thought of that vaccine point. That's a brilliant point, and boy, that is going to be a tough sell with the public. But we haven't looked at that. I don't know, Christina. I don't know if you've seen anything. We haven't seen anything.
One thing that always comes to mind for me on the questions of Iraq and Afghanistan, was it worth it? How has it shaped people's views of sort of American use of military power abroad? Is think about this. This November election will be the first time that someone who was not alive when 9/11 happened will be able to vote. That's how long we've been in Afghanistan. That someone who was born after 9/11 is now an adult and can vote this November. And so these are conflicts that they have been going on for some of these new voters' entire lives. And I see in a lot of data a great deal of skepticism from young people that American projection of power overseas through military force has any potential upside. That doesn't mean that they don't want a strong military. It doesn't mean they don't want America to be able to defend itself. But the idea that we can go promote our values through strength abroad is just viewed with a pretty skeptical eye from a lot of younger voters.
I think part of
this is such
people have just grown weary and frustrated about Iraq and Afghanistan. And they just have this attitude of, you know what, the hell with it. This thing is never going to fix itself. And, you know, we have a son that served in combat as an infantryman in Afghanistan. And David was perfectly willing to go back into combat, but just not in Afghanistan, because it just wasn't worth him losing his friends. It wasn't worth it. There was no solution. And I think that's sort of the weariness and the withdrawal from the world that we're seeing out there is just simply a reaction to those two things. And, you know, you just kind of wonder maybe when Iraq and Afghanistan, if they ever do get in the rearview mirror, whether things will be in a position to kind of go back and play our traditional leadership role. But right now, they're sort of traumatized by these two places. They just want to get the heck out and don't care that much about how we get out.
You know, it's so interesting to me that when Barack Obama said that he was going to set the deadline for withdrawal of troops, Republicans went to DEFCON 1. And now we saw, again, at the Republican convention, all this talk about how we pulled the troops out. Of course, the fact is they haven't pulled the troops out. We don't know how many are there, but there's reason to believe there are just as many there now as there were in 2016. But that's just a complete reversal of form in these things. Now, there's another place with the withdrawal of troops, which I think will have no impact on voters, but which is especially striking as well in terms of the party change. And that is the pledge to withdraw troops from Germany, which has real great implications for Europe and for, again, our relations with Russia. And that hasn't penetrated in any way, and I haven't even seen it mentioned. So it's one of the pivotal foreign policy questions that also gets at the Trump relationship with Putin that is off the radar screen and reinforces the notion that even when these things are extremely important, it's hard to get them to penetrate public attention.
You know, what's going to be interesting is traditionally one of the three presidential debates is devoted more often, you know, mostly to foreign policy. And given everything is so important and not really being talked about in any kind of a serious way, that I think that'll be a very revealing debate. I really do. And I think we'll learn a lot because we're not learning on a day-to-day basis, that's for sure.
We're going to actually move to some questions from our viewers, if that's okay with you guys. All right, foreign interference and disinformation. This is an interesting question. Or this question is, are voters more aware and alert in 2020, and do we run the risk of questioning the election outcome as a result? What do you guys make of this disinformation, that question, and just how it's changing your ability to gauge public opinion? Belinda, you want to start?
Well, you confused me with the last tail end of that. So, Claire, tell me if I'm not answering the question that you're asking. But People are very worried about tampering in the elections. They're also very worried and very aware of misinformation and disinformation. They see it as both an international problem and a national problem. And it pops up. This is an interesting, and Charlie, I'll be interested in your opinion on this. This is an impact on state and local races too. I mean, in the last election, we actually monitored the bots, and like Montana, my home state, and Maine, where Charlie is right now, those were the top two states in terms of bots and involvement in the Senate races. And in fact, we often joked in Montana, there are whole villages in Moldova devoted to Montana. So this disinformation, this interference is something that people are quite aware of. They don't know what to do about it. They're not very good judges of it. And right now, they don't hold the platforms as responsible as they should. And there are a lot of efforts on the Democratic side to get people to hold the platforms more accountable. The last thing I'll say, and Kristen will have some interesting things on this to say as well, there's nothing like a good woman politician to invoke misinformation campaigns. And we see this as a very bipartisan phenomena. And the way these women are treated is unimaginable. And sexualized misinformation, this whole child predator thing, which is a thread they're pulling through the Republican convention. So that is a huge concern for those of us bipartisanly who are really committed to women politicians.
I think one thing that's happening, I agree with everything Celinda said, but I think one thing is that, yes, Democrats and a lot of people were just sort of traumatized by the results of the 2016 election, but things are so edgy, so hyper partisan now, and people remember, or a lot of us remember, 2000 election and Florida, and where half of the country was going to feel like the election was stolen. And the only question was which half. And and we thought things were partisan then. Heck, that was like a candy store now. So I think they're kind of pulling these things together and terrified that if there is a close election, and by the way, now I don't think right this moment, I don't think it is close, but anyway, but if it does get to be close, if it is disputed or disputable, they've got visions of 2000 coming back, and I think people are they don't know what to think, but it scares the hell out of them.
Well, in 2000, it was one state where you had every election lawyer in America descend and sift through every ballot in Palm Beach County. Imagine that happening across a dozen states. Think about how many states do not or are just spinning up in the last couple of weeks robust mail-in voting programs. A state like Florida, those ballots get counted pretty quickly. They've been using lots of mail-in ballots for a while. A state like Colorado, Washington, over almost a decade, those states have built up a robust way of doing this. And then there are other states that are kind of throwing this together ramshackle at the last minute. And you are going to see, I worry, a ton of folks sitting around and going, does this signature match on this absentee ballot? And this being widespread, and it just feeding into a pre-existing idea that the elections are somehow invalid, either from the left because of foreign interference and voter suppression, or from the right because of voter fraud. And that makes me gravely concerned for what November 4th looks like.
So we know that Donald Trump has said multiple times that the Chinese will send in millions of bogus ballots, which has no basis in reality. But it's bringing that issue in a different way, and in a way, a distraction from Russia, which our intelligence community has said under Donald Trump is actively trying to interfere in this election. And I would add, especially relevant to what my panelists have said, that when they interfered in 2016, it wasn't just to elect Donald Trump, it was to foment the divisions that have long been there in American society. And they're going to do that again as well. I'm on a couple of task forces and working very hard on many of these issues. The good news is we've had conversations with the top people at almost every social media platform, and that includes Facebook. They're very much aware of what the foreign actors, especially the Russians, but not exclusively the Russians, although some of their allies helping in this area are doing, and they'll do their best. But following on what Kristen said, and knowing something else from our surveys, which is that a supermajority of Republicans say they're going to vote in person. A supermajority of Democrats say they're going to vote by mail. The results that we get on election eve are not going to match the final results. Some of the states that are not as used to dealing with mail, and some even like New York that are, but New York having one of the most incompetent election administrations that we have ever seen, will take many, many weeks. And we know even from some of these results that they can change dramatically from the election eve to the conclusion. California is very used to dealing with absentee votes, but it took more than a month to settle for House races. And there will be much misinformation about which votes to count. We may well have the president or some of his allies on election eve declaring victory when maybe a third of all the ballots have been counted. And if we are not prepared to deal with the disinformation coming from abroad, as well as what we're going to have internally, we're going to have a mess that will make Florida look like a picnic.
The ironic thing is the president is in a deep hole in this race. And right now it's not competitive, but a focused, disciplined president could climb out of this hole, but not this one. And the thing is, he says and does things that are self-defeating. For example, by trashing vote by mail, just building on what Norm said, but by trashing vote by mail, he is becoming more reliant on in-person voting. Well, the thing about it is, because of the coronavirus, because of the inability to attract election workers, that there are going to be a lot fewer in-person polling places. He is hurting himself by discounting the validity in minds of Republicans of that whole process. So he really is hurting himself. But you noticed last week at the Democrat convention where they were saying, vote if at all possible, vote early in person, so you're not relied on the postal service. And only if you can't do that, then vote by mail early, so it's got lots of time to come in, where they're taking the situation and use it for maximum benefit, and the president is undercutting his own side.
And to that point on the voting in person, you don't know what it's going to look like in terms of the pandemic on November 3rd. And we have a question actually that I'm hoping you might be able to weigh in on in terms of what happens in October. Obviously, things could look different in a number of ways, but there is the October surprise, as we're all aware of. And so the question is from a viewer is, while you may not believe foreign policy will be a factor in the election, October surprises are always possible in today's volatile world. How could some unforeseen event move foreign policy to the forefront and shake up the race? Are there historical examples?
Well, it better be a September surprise, because by the 1st of October, you're going to have a lot of people who have already voted. So, who cares? I mean, I'm being facetious, but seriously, it would be interesting. I don't know that anybody has this number, but to try to figure out where would be the midpoint on the calendar where half of the votes that ultimately come in will have been cast. And the first debate's on September 29th. And my guess is a big chunk will be done before then. I mean, the first ballot, North Carolina mails out their ballots on September 4th. And given the intensity of emotions and feelings out there, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to vote as fast as they can just because they feel so intensely about this election.
So we know what Democrats fear as an October surprise to start with is the so-called Durham report. We have a U.S. attorney who has been empowered by the Attorney General, Bill Barr, who's been going around the country. He just has had multiple interviews with, for example, with Mike Hayden, with John Brennan, all geared towards showing that the Obama-Biden administration manipulated the election to try to kill Donald Trump's chances with a phony Russian investigation. And that will also spill over into Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and Ukraine, very possibly. They fear that. The more traditional October surprise would either be a war or a treaty or something that undercuts or changes the subject for the election. It's entirely possible. We have to keep in mind that Bibi Netanyahu would also love to see an October surprise, that it may come not just because of a premeditated action by a president, but by events in the world. We could have a confrontation with Iran. We could see India and Pakistan, who are always on the verge of something. We could see definitely something happen with China or elsewhere in that region. There are a lot of things that could happen that could provide a kind of late distraction. Also, keep your eye on the southern border, which is another place where I could very easily expect something to happen. It's been a distraction used by Donald Trump multiple times when he didn't like the way things were going.
You mean caravans?
Yeah.
The other October surprise that I think we might see, and I really, Charlie, you made your point right, and Democrats are accentuating this because Democrats are trying to push for everybody to vote early. We're off the vote by mail, vote in person saying, and just say vote early, vote as soon as you get that ballot. Be one of the first to vote against Donald Trump, which is very motivating to Democrats. I think the other October surprise is the vaccine and whether it's real or not. And that's the other thing that could lend some unpredictability to this election.
Let me try to, that's a really good point. We've already seen some of the concerns being raised about politics going into that process. We have a question about, maybe Kristen, maybe you can take this one, about independent voters. The question is, we talk all the time about independent voters and the weight of those who aren't staunch supporters of one party or another. What do independent voters care about, and what would tilt them one way or another in this election?
If I can jump in, go ahead.
Go for it, Charlie.
Well, I mean, you've got the Trump lovers, you have the Trump loathers, then you have the in-betweeners, which you could call them independents. Now, the thing about independents is there's a reason why they're independent. And that is because most of them, they don't follow news, they don't follow current events, they don't care anything about politics, and most of them will end up not voting. So the sliver of people right in the middle that are honest to God in the middle that will actually vote, you're talking about a really small group of people. And a lot of that group, they, on the one hand, they loved where the economy was, and they gave President Trump full credit. But at the same time, a lot of them had reservations, doubts, concerns about his character, him as a person, him as a leader, but it was offset by the strong economy. You take away the strong economy and those doubts among this sliver of people in the middle that tend to be kind of cynical anyway, that just makes, I think where the president has severely compromised his ability to go after and to be trusted by those people above anybody else. So that's why I just think this is a really uphill. But that group of independents, I mean, most of them aren't even really independents either way. They lean one way or the other, as Norm and the pollsters will tell you. That it's what are the pure independents? 5%, 6%? What do you guys think?
There's a really interesting study that Pew Research put out a couple of weeks ago where they have a panel where they ask the same group of folks about their political views repeatedly. And in September of 2018, they logged who all are Republicans and they say they're independents, but they lean Republican. They're functionally Republicans. And they found that between September of 2018 and July of this year, that about 9% of those folks had outright switched to becoming Democrats, and another 3% said they no longer had a lean. But Democrats experienced the same thing. In that same period of time, 9% of Democrats said that they were now Republicans or leaned Republican, and another 3% said they now had no lean. So it's a very small group of people, but I actually think that's part of why, these party conventions we've seen over the last 2 weeks, I'm actually skeptical of how much they are going to swing those independent voters, because independent voters are probably not watching hour upon hour upon hour of these conventions. What I think they're trying to do is help Democrats and Republicans who may be wobbly find that old time religion and come back home, and say, look, you may not love the way Donald Trump tweets. You may not love the way he handles himself. You may not love the way he's handled COVID, but don't you remember why you're a Republican in the first place? And here's Mike Pence, and here's Dan Crenshaw. And I think that's where you're seeing parties beginning to really focus, is trying to make sure that folks on the margins and folks who should be in their base don't really go wobbly in this election.
So,
We have
one of the
1 minute.
things that we've
Wanna weigh in,
seen in
Norm?
the last few years is that there's a growing divide between, and let's just look at white voters, because we don't see a whole lot with others, although Hispanic voters are an interesting subcategory who have not gone in the same direction with the same magnitude as African Americans or Asian Americans. But among white Americans, we have this huge divide between college educated ones and non-college educated ones. Trump's base is the non-college educated white voters, the so-called working class white voters. But an awful lot of those college educated white voters in suburbs voted for him in 2016 and then voted for Democrats in 2018. And a lot of the struggle now is over those voters. I suspect in the Pew numbers, a whole lot of those who were Republicans who switched or who moved into a different category were from that suburban base. It's why Trump rather inelegantly is going after suburban housewives, which isn't quite the right category he might want to aim for. But what we've seen, the New York Times has an obsession with this. They've done 1 million stories. All of these suburban voters who don't really like Trump, they rebel against his coarseness. And yet, on the other hand, we see them sort of thinking about going back to their original spot, and how you can motivate them. How many will decide they're not going to vote because there's a dissonance there? How you motivate people or move them back to an original orientation is going to be a very, very interesting phenomenon. And of course, on the part of Biden, it's going to be the Scranton working class roots to try and lower the numbers of what Trump gets from those working class white voters, moving in some areas, if he can, to get them from 80-20 to maybe 70-30 or 60-40. If Hillary Clinton had done that in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, we would have a different result.
There's some interesting research that go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say we're about 1 minute maybe before we're out of time.
There's some interesting research that when you look at suburban voters, look at who they are and where they came from, and the ones that migrated away out of the city, they're very Democratic. But the ones that used to live in small town rural America and for work reasons or whatever moved into the suburbs, they're still bringing that small town rural point of view, and they tend to be much more Republican. So it's just an interesting way to look at suburban voters that I hadn't actually heard before.
That's a great point, and you've all made so many great points. Thank you so much. That's unfortunately all we have time for. I could talk with you all about this for another hour, but that's not in the plan. So thank you, and we really appreciate your time. This was a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure there will be plenty more to talk about over the next 2 months. So thank you, Aaron.
Carol.